Hello Internet, welcome back to my experimental Cataclysm series. If you're new here, this is a show where we talk about the development of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, going over recent additions to the game. Now mostly I focus on new content and new mechanics, so we mostly don't talk about bug fixes and things like that. And hey, this is our first show after a pretty long hiatus. 0.F has been released and we're getting back to regular updates for the game. Now this does raise a few issues. As a brief recap, instead of putting things fully on hold while they worked on stable, the devs actually created a different branch of the game. What this means is that many changes were actually added but not available for us to play with. So now that we're post-release, things are finally fully in the game. So this means that there are many changes that have been made very rapidly to the experimental version of Cataclysm. Now in addition to this, the sources that I usually use to make this show included the automatically generated change logs, which are currently broken, and I also use the changelog that gets posted on Reddit, but that was also not posted this week. So odds are good that I might have missed some things between all that stuff put together, so this is not an all-inclusive show. Obviously we just talk about the things I want to talk about. So anyway, this episode will not only contain changes that were added over the last couple of weeks, but it will also include some older changes that were added while we were waiting for 0.F stable to release. Now there is one thing in particular at the end of the show that seems to have a lot of people upset, so we're going to talk about that. And yeah, in summation, there were a lot of changes. I'm not covering all or even most of them, and I just handpicked a few things that I wanted to shout out or that I thought you would want to hear. And of course, there will be spoilers just due to the nature of this show. But that's enough of the intro. That was just for people who might not have seen this series before. Let's just jump into the changes here. Firstly, I suppose we should give an update about the graphical overmap. Now, I did make a video last week about this and what this change was and what some of the initial issues were. I would encourage you to go back and check that out if you're interested. I am happy to say, though, that some of the kinks are already being ironed out. First off, they have added a toggle so you can now disable the new graphical overmap if you want the old ASCII map instead. This is a nice feature to have while they iron out some of the major kinks with the new display. And if you'll recall from the previous video, the main issue was that some of the tiles on the map screen did not have any fallback tiles. In other words, if they did not have a sprite in the particular tile set, it would try to fall back to an ASCII character. However, some of these tiles, specifically the road tiles, did not have an ASCII fallback. Now this has been largely resolved. The main offender here, like I said, was the roads and those forest trail things. Most, if not all of these tiles now have been fixed, so which should make the map look significantly better really regardless of which tile set you use. However, just to make a quick shout out here for Retro Days, I think that is still the best map that's in the game at the moment. I think it looks great. However, although this was resolved, there are still issues with the map. You'll notice in my images here that the nameplates for towns are still messed up as of the time of this recording. I've seen people post images where it looks perfectly fine for them, I'm not sure, but for me and my map the nameplates are still broken, so take that as you will. I also have these large black bars at the bottom of my map screen. Unfortunately, I'm the only person I have seen who has run into this issue, so I mean, it sucks for me, I guess. I have no idea what is causing it, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to fix it when no one else seems to be experiencing this problem. But I'm adding it in here just in case someone is watching who has the same problem that I do. I don't have any insight on what's going on there. Now, all of that said, I still believe that the graphical overmap is an actual fantastic feature. Oh, and in my previous video, I forgot to mention that this change also included the ability to zoom in and out of the map, which is just amazing. So in summation, it's a great feature, and I think we're all going to end up using it in the future, but for now, it's still a little bit borked, and my recommendation is to use the old map for the time being. Moving things along, however, let's talk about the addition of a taser drone by Xenomorph. Now this appears to basically just be a version of the manhacks that we already have in the game, only it's equipped with a taser. I couldn't find anything about where it currently spawns. It looks like this was just the implementation of the crafting recipe and the creature itself. Likely in the future, if it hasn't already happened, this will probably be added to the possible deployables from the dispatch robot that we're all probably familiar with. And since it's craftable, you could make yourself a few taser drones, which is pretty neat. It's nothing crazy really, but I thought it was cool and I figured I would shout it out. Next up, we have a new random mission added by El Jacozo. Sorry if I say your name wrong. I thought this was pretty cool when I saw it. We've all met NPCs in the game and they will often have missions for us that we can do. Now when you receive a mission from an NPC, it's generally pulled from a list, and that's what this changes. It adds a new possible mission to that list. More importantly, this mission allows your inner pyromaniac to shine. I couldn't get footage of this because frankly I don't know how missions work or how to debug them, but essentially the NPC will mark a house on the map and you will have to go and burn it down. After the mission, the NPC should join the player and some fire and gasoline will be spawned on the building to ensure that it properly burns more efficiently. Or at least that's what I gathered from reading the PR. It might work a smidge different than that in actual practice. It's also worth noting that in the comments here on this particular PR, it was pointed out that the spawning fire and gasoline can in fact set the player or NPC on fire if they happen to be on that tile, so maybe don't finish this off when you're actually in the area. Seems like something you should avoid. Moving right along, let's talk about the addition of a hunting lodge. Now, I'll show you a little bit of the building here, but we won't look at the whole place or in the files, just spoilers, I guess, I don't know. But essentially, Mail Clips here has added a hunting lodge, which is exactly what it sounds like. In general, we do need more rural buildings in the game. Anyone who's been driving around lately has noticed that it's a lot of warehouses and light industry. We really need more stuff that can spawn out there in that countryside. In fact, if you're in a contributing mood and you're watching this, please go brainstorm some rural buildings. Seriously, please, it would be nice. But anyway, this added a hunting lodge, which is a great addition to the game. There were some issues around its spawning, but I believe that has been fixed now, or it is going to be fixed in the very near future. This is also available as a starting location. You can find this in the safe place scenario, and you can change your location on that final screen in character creation by pressing the / key. Now this is where the issues with its spawning seem to have been noticed, so if you're trying to generate this location and the game is giving you an error about failing to place it, sorry, like I said, it's either already been fixed or the fix should be merged soon, and that's about all I have to say about that. Seems like a cool new location. Next up, we have some new feral creatures. Again, spoiler warning, we are going to talk about these in some detail, and if you don't want that, you should probably skip to the next section of the video. Now, we've had ferals for a while now, but anyone who has played the game for a significant period of time knows that we really only have that one iteration. Like, yeah, they have different weapons, but ferals are otherwise identical. They also don't have any upgrades, which definitely needs to be a thing in the near future, so if you play later into the game, it's kind of funny to see just normal feral creatures sprinkled around with like skeletal juggernauts and huge boomers and stuff like that. Well, Sour Cell? Sorry, again with the names I don't know. But they've added some new feral creatures. Now these are specifically found in labs in the game. It's nice to see ferals being expanded in general, and I know that a few of the devs have been talking about expanding lab creatures and items, so this hits both of those things. Anyway, we've got 2 flavors of feral security guards, and we have a new feral scientist. Now the main thing to note here is that one of these security guards actually has a gun. Yes, a feral with a gun, probably something we're going to see a little bit more in the future. Now obviously this creature is wildly dangerous. A lucky shot from an enemy with a gun can definitely end your current run. On the plus side though, it is only a 9mm, which isn't exactly a powerhouse caliber, but you know, being shot is generally not a good thing. Now it will, on the positive side, drop this weapon upon its death with 100% certainty, so that's always nice, and it's actually the M9 Beretta. More importantly, it's using standard 9mm rounds, which is the jacketed hollow point round for those who actually care about this sort of thing, and it's listed as having 26 ballistic damage. Now, that can still hurt you a lot, but depending on your armor, you can probably tank a few of these rounds to the chest before you end up in any real danger. That said, around to the head, I mean, just from what I know in real life, you generally don't want to be shot in the head. Now, the gun attack for the security guard is a cooldown of 10, which isn't terribly fast, and it's not terribly slow either. They'll likely get a shot off before you can kill them, but once they do, I recommend just approaching them and dealing with them as quickly as possible. And also, the range on this is as low as 0, so even in melee, they will continue trying to shoot you. But anyway, that's enough about them. Let's talk about the other variants. The other version of the feral security guard comes with a flashlight, which again is a 100% drop from the corpse. Although frankly, by the time you're exploring an area with this security guard, you're probably past the point of needing any flashlights, so I don't know how relevant that really is. Now both security ferals, though, they do include the cop gear item group, which does include riot armor among other things, so you can probably get some valuable loot from them. Then let's talk about the other new feral. This is a feral scientist. They decided to name them Mad Scientists, which I think is cute, but I also think it's a bit of a mistake. I think they should be labeled with feral in their names so that they're easily identified. And I don't have as much to say about the scientists. It's worth pointing out that at the moment they can be dissected for CBM, same as the current zombie scientists. Obviously, we haven't really talked about it, but bionics are going to be significantly reworked in the pretty near future, but for the time being, this is a place that you can get some CBMs. And then let's just move along to the next change here. We have a new scenario from Night. It's called Bordered, and the idea here is that it restricts the player to the overmap that they spawn on. Now this is quite large. I believe it's 180 by 180 map tiles, although you will lose a tile at each edge due to the wall spawning there. And honestly, I think this is a really great idea for a starting scenario, and I probably will check it out at some point. But anyway, the scenario, basically getting into it, restricts you by placing large walls at the edge of this section of the map. Now these walls are quite thick, they're 24 tiles or something like that, and outside of using the debug teleport option, I don't really know how you would get to the other side. From what I saw, it does extend into the air and underground, so you're not going to be able to dig your way out. But honestly, really though, if you're doing this scenario, you should probably not try to get out. I mean, it sort of defeats the purpose of the scenario in the first place. And ultimately, if you want to keep playing the character after looting the entire map or whatever, you could just debug, teleport out, and play the game normally, as far as I know. I really don't have much to say about this. I just really thought it was a cool idea, and it's definitely something out of the box that we have not seen before, so I wanted to make you aware of it. Now next up from Extension Driver, we do have another new scenario, specifically the car crash scenario. I do love these new starting places. I think it's one of the best things to do for Cataclysm because it really allows you to have a lot of replayability. So Car Crash puts you in a crashed vehicle. Now I'm a little fuzzy on the details. It seems to spawn you in random locations all over the place, so there's not really much reliable information there on where you will spawn specifically. I also noticed that sometimes it spawns you in a fully functional vehicle, which in my opinion sort of defeats the purpose of a crash scenario when you can just drive away. In fact, in my testing, it spawned me in a fully functional SWAT vehicle, so not only did I immediately have the ability to drive away from the zombies around me, but I also was in a fully armored and pretty valuable vehicle. But when it's working intentionally though, spawning in an accident, wounded and bleeding, surrounded by the undead, it can be a pretty challenging start. And it seems to me that spawning in a functional vehicle is probably just a bug and it will get sorted out eventually. But I really like this scenario. I think this was a great change, and I think it's a really cool thing that I'm definitely going to check out in the future. Next up, we have an expansion of possible base camp locations. Now there were several of these added to the game, and the one I'm looking at here is the Lighthouse Base Camp. Now I haven't really played with faction camps too much in the game, but they were previously restricted to fields, fire stations, and evac shelters. Now Kruluio has added camp locations for mansions, fire lookout towers, radio towers, pottery cottages, and of course the lighthouses as well. Now obviously this is an enormous expansion from what we had previously. Unfortunately, due to the nature of camps, I can't really cover what these different locations offer in the way of facilities because each one has its own upgrade path. So instead, I will just encourage you to go out there and set up some camps in these new locations. I think this is a really great addition. People generally don't expand too much on NPCs or NPC base camps, so I was really surprised to see that someone had gone through and added these many new locations. Now next we have a bionics change to talk about, but I thought we should touch briefly on what is going to be changing with CBMs in the future. Now for those of you who don't know, CBMs are going to be heavily reworked probably in the pretty near future. In fact, the foundation for these major changes are already being put in place, already being contributed to the game, and already being merged into the vanilla game. Now, I won't spoil things too much yet, there's still a lot to be done before we see it actually materialize, and if you're interested though, you can head over to the dev Discord or wherever and ask about Exodii, which I'm pretty sure I'm saying right, Exodii. I put it on screen here so you can see how it's spelled. People talk about this pretty frequently in the dev Discord, and I'm sure someone will talk your ear off about them if you ask. In fact, if you're interested in the dev Discord on the CDDA-discussion channel, there is a pinned message explaining what the Exodii kinda are doing and why this change is being made. But anyway, they're being reworked, and as a result, many creatures that previously had bionics will have them removed, or the monster itself is going to be reworked to fit the new lore. Now as such, Leviathan Fiend has removed bionics from the Shocker zombies. Now before anyone gets huffy, because I know you're going to get huffy about this, the planned bionics changes are probably going to make it much easier for players to get their hands on bionics and get them installed. So this removal, okay, it's a transition process, and I suspect that the transition will be a bit rough just because of the nature of how these things work, and our old way of playing is going to be forced to change. Ultimately though, I'm excited to see how this plays out, and I know people have this knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, they're taking my CBMs. That is really not the case. We just have to let this all materialize. Now, a full discussion on these changes will happen as we see more of this. I will talk about this. But for now, I just wanted to point out that the Shocker zombie variants have had their CBMs removed. I believe this affected all Shocker variants, so you're going to have to lean a little bit harder on the other zombies with CBMs when you go hunting for bionics. And then finally, let's talk about the change that seems to have a lot of people, I don't know, angry or just being aggressive. I'm not really sure how to describe it. So let's talk about generic guns. So recently a new option was added to Cataclysm, and this allows you to enable or disable brand names for guns. i.e. showing brand names, your M4 is called the M4A1, which is the name of the gun. With brand names disabled, this is simply converted to a NATO assault rifle. So that is the gist of the change. It takes the brand names for guns and instead abstracts them into a more simple and generic form for people who want to play with generic guns. That's basically it. That's the change. We now have the option to enable or disable these generic guns directly through the game, where previously we would have to actually use a mod to make this happen. And in that regard, I think this change is perfectly fine, and it makes things more accessible for people who do not care about gun variants and don't care about guns in general. Also, in Cataclysm, let's be honest, many of the firearms are virtually identical. For example, if you pick up basically any 223 rifle and you compare it to any other 223 rifle, you'll find that there are very minimal differences in how they perform in combat. And even when there are differences, they have basically no impact on the game whatsoever. So again, on the surface, I think this is a perfectly fine addition, but I do have a few complaints about how it is currently implemented. So firstly, generic guns is enabled by default. You will notice when you update your game, at some point, you're going to flip from having the brand names to having the generic guns. I think this is actually a really terrible choice because I believe the majority of players do in fact want the proper gun names. I'll put any amount of money on that. We can go poll the community right now. There's 0% chance that the majority of players want to have these generic guns. So to make that on by default, it just seems like a ridiculous choice to me. I don't really understand that at all. And I personally, just to speak personally a bit, I hate when games have abstracted guns, and maybe I'm petty, but I have definitely stopped playing games for this reason. I'm probably in the minority there. I don't believe most people would walk away from a game just because it has abstracted guns, but man, I actually hate that. It's a huge pet peeve of mine. You go back to something like Max Payne or whatever from 20 years ago, it just says pistol, shotgun, things like that, but it bugs the crap out of me. So having generic guns on by default, yeah, maybe, I guess it makes the game a smidge more accessible, but I really don't believe that this should be made the default. A modern game that uses realism as a core tenet of development, I think it's just crazy to make this the default setting. So that's my take on that, and yeah, I know I'm being maybe a little aggro, but it's pretty rare that I strongly disagree with something the dev team has done. This is a clear preference thing though, and since it's purely a preference, I think the default should be whatever the majority of players would want. It does not make sense for me to use the minority of players who want generic guns to determine the default setting of this new option. But let's move on from that. The other issue I've run into is that I'm getting generic guns spawning in my game despite having their proper names enabled. Now, I do find this kind of annoying. It seems to mostly be shotguns, and there is already a fix in the works for this problem. Another simulacrum seems to already know what the issue was, and I believe has already merged the change. So if you're like me and you're bumping into generic guns, I would recommend you update to a more recent version. It should take care of that issue. But I know some of you will be on older versions, so I wanted to add that in here for people who might see this and not understand why it's happening. And frankly, this is I'm much more understanding of this because it's like, this is a natural thing for a new feature to have bugs like that attached to it. I don't like it, but it's sort of expected. The whole on by default thing, that's just, I don't understand that. But now that I've gotten my personal gripes out of the way, I have to mention that the community seems to be just a little bit toxic surrounding this particular issue. Now, I've seen a lot of people complaining about generic guns in a completely non-constructive and very poorly reasoned way. Seems to be a section of the community that absolutely hate this change and think it should be entirely removed. Now, most of the time, the people who are doing this complaining, they don't offer any real argument, much less a well-reasoned one. And to those of you that are hating this change for no apparent reason, I think you need to cool it. You're being a little aggressive. A lot of people in the community seem to be just entirely too aggressive. Adding this option for generic guns, it doesn't hurt you. I mean, maybe you get some spawns in your game for a little while, but it doesn't hurt you in any way. And it will, in fact, make the game more accessible for people who feel overwhelmed when they see a ton of gun names and calibers and yada yada, etc. This change does not have to impact you. You can just disable it and not worry about it. The addition of this feature will be beneficial for some people. And I even told you my personal complaints at the beginning of this section. It's totally fine to disagree with aspects of the implementation or be annoyed if you're getting generic guns when you have the brand names enabled. But it is 100% not okay for you to talk about the people who implement these changes. It's not okay for you to say, oh, if you don't like gun names, you shouldn't be playing the game. That's unacceptable. It's very similar to when I see players actively badmouth people who play unstable. You have no say in what other people want to do with their version of the game. So that's my final word, I guess. I feel like we talk about this all the time. I just don't understand when people go out of their way to tear other people down. This is a video game, ladies and gentlemen. We're all here because we enjoy this game, and whether or not you agree with certain development, whether or not you agree with certain decisions, you don't have to be a jerk about it. You can just talk to people like they're normal human beings. Anyway, that's a real sour note for us to end on. Internet, hope you liked the video. Welcome back to the series. I'm glad we can be doing this again. And until next time, I hope you're all doing well out there. I love your face, and I'll see you next time.